Swimming pools, luxury accommodations, entertainment complexes, and sprawling beachfront properties stretching across kilometers of coastline along the East Sea of Japan. These were the grand features showcased at Onsong Kulma, North Korea's most ambitious tourism project, when state media released promotional footage in early summer of 2025. The resort promised to accommodate 20,000 visitors simultaneously across its 4-kilometer beachside development. Kim Jong-un himself conducted a ceremonial tour, complete with military parades and propaganda displays. Yet within mere weeks of welcoming its first Russian tourists on July 7th, the entire operation went silent. The question isn't just what happened, it's what this reveals about a regime's relationship with the outside world. North Korea's hidden tourism empire. Behind the regime's carefully constructed facade lies a tourism empire that once generated massive revenue streams through methodical exploitation of international curiosity. In 2019, over 350,000 Chinese tourists crossed the border into North Korea, generating approximately $175 million in annual revenue, according to NK News, marking the highest visitor count in the country's modern history. These weren't just curious travelers seeking adventure. They represented a carefully cultivated market that understood exactly what they were purchasing. The numbers reveal the true scale of this operation. Chinese tour operators marketed North Korea as an accessible glimpse into living socialism, complete with revolutionary monuments and political theater that mainland China had largely abandoned. The pricing remained affordable for middle-class Chinese families, with package tour costing between $300 and $800 depending on duration and destinations. Chinese visitors accounted for roughly 95% of that $175 million total, creating a dependency that would prove catastrophic when the relationship soured. Beijing's diplomatic relationship with Pyongyang made this tourism boom possible in ways that other countries couldn't replicate. Chinese citizens enjoyed streamlined visa processes and regular connections that turned North Korea visits into accessible getaways. Chinese tourists primarily traveled overland via Dandong Sinaju or by air on restricted flights from Beijing and Shenyang, per BBC and Reuters reporting. The Chinese government viewed these exchanges as beneficial for regional stability, allowing its citizens to experience North Korean culture while maintaining important diplomatic channels. The economic impact reached far beyond simple hotel bookings and meal purchases. This money flowed directly into government coffers through state-owned tourism agencies like the Korea International Travel Company and Korea International Youth Travel Company, along with state-controlled hotels, restaurants, and transportation services. The regime carefully structured the entire industry to maximize foreign currency earnings while maintaining complete control over visitor experiences. Every dollar spent contributed to a tourism infrastructure that employed thousands of North Koreans in approved sectors. Visitors experienced a highly regulated but genuinely popular itinerary centered almost exclusively around Pyongyang's showcase attractions. Tour groups visited Kim Il-sung Square for choreographed political demonstrations, toured the victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum with its anti-American exhibits, and witnessed the mass games spectacles that displayed North Korean organizational capabilities. The Juche Tower, Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery, and various monuments to the Kim dynasty formed the backbone of most tour packages. Some operators offered visits The grand opening spectacle. The morning of June 24, 2025, marked a pivotal moment in North Korean history as Kim Jong-un arrived at Onsong Kulma for what state media portrayed as the most significant tourism development in the country's modern era. The ceremonial tour unfolded with characteristic North Korean grandeur, featuring rows of uniformed military personnel standing at attention along the resort's main boulevards. Red banners and North Korean flags decorated every available surface, while orchestrated crowds of resort workers applauded enthusiastically as the leader's motorcade wound through the sprawling complex. State television cameras captured every moment of the carefully choreographed event, broadcasting footage that would be replayed continuously across North Korean media channels for weeks afterward. The resort's physical specifications dwarfed anything North Korea had previously constructed for international visitors. The complex stretched across 4 kilometers of pristine coastline, featuring approximately 150 hotels designed to accommodate the massive influx of visitors that planners anticipated. Each structure was designed to blend modern architectural elements with traditional Korean styling, creating a visual landscape that aimed to compete with established international beach destinations. The hotels ranged from modest guesthouses to luxury towers, all connected by landscaped walkways and transportation networks that allowed easy movement throughout the massive site. The capacity numbers alone revealed the extraordinary ambitions driving the project. Onsong Kulma was engineered to accommodate 20,000 simultaneous visitors, a figure that would make it the largest single-site beach resort complex anywhere in the world. This capacity exceeded famous resort destinations like Cancun's Hotel Zone or the Las Iguanas complex in Spain, placing North Korea's tourism facilities in direct competition with established global vacation markets. The infrastructure required to support such numbers included multiple dining facilities, entertainment venues, recreational areas, and service buildings that created what amounted to a complete tourist city along the East Sea coastline. Russian Ambassador Alexander Matsugora occupied the position of honor during the opening ceremony, standing alongside Kim Jong-un as they toured the resort's flagship facilities. Matsugora's prominent presence sent unmistakable signals about the intended audience for Onsong Kulma's operations. The ambassador's participation wasn't merely diplomatic courtesy, it represented a deliberate message about North Korea's strategic tourism priorities and international partnerships. State media coverage emphasized the Russian diplomats' enthusiastic reactions to various resort features, creating propaganda narratives that portrayed the facility as internationally acclaimed even before welcoming its first paying guests. North Korean media outlets painted the resort opening as the country's definitive entry into global luxury tourism competition. State television broadcasts described Onsong Kulma as representing world-class standards and international excellence that would attract discriminating travelers from around the globe. These descriptions emphasized the resort's ability to match or exceed facilities found in established tourism markets, suggesting that North Korea had successfully developed hospitality infrastructure capable of competing with traditional vacation destinations. The propaganda messaging positioned the opening as proof of North Korean technological and organizational capabilities that could rival any developed nation. The resort's claim to being the world's largest single-site beach resort became a central element of the opening ceremony's promotional messaging. State media repeatedly emphasized the scale and scope of the development, comparing it favorably to famous international resort destinations while highlighting unique features that supposedly set it apart from competitors. These comparisons weren't subtle. North Korean broadcasts explicitly positioned Onsong Kulma as superior to resorts in Thailand, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean, claiming advantages in both size and quality that would attract international attention and visitor interest. The pricing strategy revealed the economic realities underlying the resort's operations. Tour packages targeting Russian visitors carried price tags starting at $1,800, representing approximately 60% of the average monthly salary in Russia, according to BBC reporting. This premium positioning aimed to maximize revenue per visitor rather than attracting large numbers of budget travelers. The pricing reflected the resort's focus on quality over quantity, targeting affluent Russian tourists who could afford luxury vacation experiences despite international economic sanctions and regional tensions. The substantial cost made Onsong Kulma vacations accessible only to upper-income Russian citizens. The complete absence of Chinese tour operators from the opening ceremony marked a dramatic departure from North Korea's traditional tourism partnerships. Chinese companies that had previously dominated North Korean tourism arrangements were nowhere to be seen during the resort's launch events. This absence wasn't accidental. It reflected fundamental changes in North Korea's international relationships and economic priorities that had emerged over the previous several years. The shift away from Chinese tourism partnerships demonstrated Kim Jong-un's willingness to sacrifice established revenue streams in favor of new strategic alliances that better served broader political objectives. The first confirmed Russian tour group was scheduled to arrive on July 7th, creating anticipation for the resort's transition from ceremonial showpiece to operational tourism facility. This inaugural group would test all the systems and services that had been developed during the resort's lengthy construction period, providing the first real-world evaluation of whether North Korean hospitality infrastructure could meet international visitor expectations. The July 7th arrival date became a crucial milestone that would determine whether Onsong Kulma could successfully transition from propaganda symbol to functioning business operation. The stakes surrounding this tourism gamble extended far beyond simple hospitality revenue. Onsong Kulma represented North Korea's largest single investment in international tourism infrastructure, requiring years of construction work and massive resource allocation during a period of economic hardship and international isolation. The resort's success or failure would influence North Korea's approach to tourism development for years to come, potentially determining whether the country would continue pursuing international visitor markets or abandon tourism entirely in favor of other economic strategies. State media coverage emphasized the resort's role in demonstrating North Korea's ability to compete internationally while maintaining complete control over visitor experiences. The opening ceremony showcased this balance between openness and control, welcoming international attention while ensuring that every aspect of the event reinforced approved narratives about North Korean achievements and capabilities. This approach reflected the fundamental tensions that would determine whether the resort could actually deliver on its ambitious promises when real tourists finally arrived. 3 weeks of operation. The first Russian tourists stepped off their chartered flight at Onson Airport on July 7, 2025, marking the beginning of what would become one of the shortest-lived tourism experiments in modern history. These initial visitors represented a carefully selected group who had paid the premium $1,800 fee for an 8-day North Korean adventure that included both Pyongyang and the brand-new Onsong Kulma Resort. The group consisted primarily of middle-aged Russian professionals, military veterans, and cultural enthusiasts who viewed the trip as a unique opportunity to experience a country that remained largely closed to international visitors. Their arrival generated immediate attention from international media outlets that had been tracking North Korea's tourism reopening efforts with intense curiosity. This wasn't North Korea's first attempt at post-pandemic tourism reopening. The Rason Special Economic Zone had briefly welcomed visitors from February 20 to March 5, 2025, according to reports from RFA and Euronews, serving as a limited test run for international tourism operations. However, Onsong Kulma represented a far more ambitious undertaking that would determine whether North Korea could successfully transition from small-scale experimental tourism to large-scale international hospitality operations. The Russian tourists encountered an experience that was meticulously orchestrated from the moment they entered North Korean airspace. Airport procedures that might take minutes in other countries stretched into hours as security personnel conducted detailed inspections of luggage, electronic devices, and personal documents. Each visitor received a comprehensive briefing about permitted activities, photography restrictions, and behavioral expectations that would govern their entire stay. North Korean guides assigned to the group spoke fluent Russian and demonstrated extensive knowledge about approved talking points related to North Korean achievements and Russian-North Korean friendship initiatives. The resort facilities that greeted these first international guests showcased impressive construction quality and attention to detail that exceeded many visitors' expectations. Hotel rooms featured modern furnishings, reliable electricity, and functional plumbing systems that represented significant improvements over older North Korean accommodation options. Restaurants served a mixture of Korean cuisine and Russian dishes prepared by chefs who had received specialized training for international visitor service. Entertainment facilities included swimming pools, tennis courts, and recreational areas that appeared professionally maintained and fully operational during the visitor's stay. However, careful observation revealed numerous signs that the resort's operations relied heavily on theatrical staging rather than genuine hospitality infrastructure. Staff members who interacted with tourists appeared to follow carefully rehearsed scripts, providing identical responses to similar questions and demonstrating limited ability to engage in spontaneous conversations about resort amenities or local culture. Activities scheduled for tourist participation followed rigid timetables that left no room for improvisation or visitor preferences. Beach excursions, cultural performances, and sightseeing tour proceeded according to predetermined scripts that prioritized propaganda messaging over authentic cultural exchange. International journalists monitoring the resort's operations began reporting suspicious patterns in the behavior of apparent resort employees and local residents. Many staff members appeared to be temporary workers who had been mobilized specifically for the tourist visits rather than permanent hospitality professionals with relevant experience and training. Local residents encountered during organized excursions demonstrated unnatural enthusiasm for interacting with foreign visitors, suggesting that their participation had been arranged and supervised by government authorities rather than occurring through organic social interactions. The controlled nature of tourist experiences became particularly apparent during cultural activities and local community visits that formed central components of the resort packages. Traditional dance performances featured the same dancers who regularly appeared at state events in Pyongyang, suggesting that entertainers had been transporting specifically for tourist shows rather than representing local Onson cultural traditions. Visits to nearby farming cooperatives and industrial facilities followed identical patterns that tourists recognized from standard North Korean propaganda tour, complete with predetermined routes, approved photography locations, and carefully vetted local representatives who delivered identical presentations about socialist achievements and international friendship. Media attention surrounding the resort's operations intensified as more details emerged about the visitor experience and operational procedures. International news outlets stationed correspondents in neighboring countries who attempted to gather information from tourists during their brief stays and after their return to Russia. Satellite imagery analysts tracked activity at the resort complex, noting unusual patterns of vehicle movement and personnel deployment that suggested extensive behind-the-scenes coordination efforts. Social media monitoring revealed limited posting activity from resort visitors, indicating either restrictions on internet access or explicit prohibitions against sharing detailed information about their experiences. Signs of operational problems became apparent even during the resort's brief period of international service. Several Russian tourists reported difficulties with basic services, including inconsistent meal quality, limited recreational equipment availability, and communication problems with staff members who appeared unfamiliar with resort facilities and procedures. Transportation arrangements between different resort areas sometimes involved delays and confusion that suggested incomplete coordination between various operational departments. These service issues weren't catastrophic, but they indicated that the resort's operations hadn't achieved the seamless functionality that would be expected from an established international hospitality facility. The economic pressures underlying the resort's operations became evident through pricing inconsistencies and payment processing difficulties that tourists encountered during their stays. Additional charges for premium services, excursions, and merchandise purchases often involved complex currency exchange procedures that created confusion and frustration for visitors who had expected more straightforward transaction processes. Some tourists reported being asked to pay for services that had supposedly been included in their original package prices, suggesting that resort financial management systems hadn't been fully developed or properly coordinated before operations began. The 3 weeks of actual operations demonstrated that North Korea had successfully constructed impressive physical facilities at Onsong Kulma, but had failed to develop the operational systems and cultural flexibility necessary for sustainable international tourism. The resort could accommodate visitors and provide basic services, but it couldn't deliver the authentic cultural experiences and spontaneous interactions that modern international travelers expected from premium vacation destinations. This operational reality would soon collide with the regime's fundamental need to maintain absolute control over every aspect of the visitor experience, creating tensions that would prove impossible to resolve. The mysterious shutdown. By July 16, 2025, these operational realities had created an untenable situation that demanded immediate action. The DPRK Korea Tour website posted a terse announcement that would send shockwaves through the limited network of operators handling North Korean tourism. The message was characteristically brief and unhelpful. The Onsong Kulma coastal tourist area was temporarily not receiving foreign tourists. No explanation accompanied this statement, no timeline for potential reopening was provided, and no contact information was offered for affected visitors or tour companies seeking clarification. The announcement appeared without fanfare on the state-run tourism portal, delivered with the same bureaucratic indifference that marked most North Korean official communications. The timing of this closure created immediate suspicion among international observers who had been tracking the resort's operations with intense interest. Just 3 weeks had passed since Kim Jong-un's ceremonial tour and the elaborate opening ceremonies that had generated substantial international media coverage. Russian tourists were still arriving at the resort, following itineraries that had been planned and paid for months in advance. The sudden reversal occurred at the precise moment when Onsong Kulma should have been hitting its operational stride, building on the initial visitor experiences to refine services and expand marketing efforts to attract additional Russian tourists. Tour operators specializing in North Korean travel found themselves in an impossible position as the closure announcement spread through their networks. Companies that had spent months negotiating arrangements with North Korean authorities, securing flight permissions, and coordinating logistics for upcoming tour groups suddenly faced the prospect of canceling all scheduled visits without warning. The operators had no direct communication channels with North Korean decision-makers who could provide clarification about the closure's duration or the possibility of refunds for affected visitors. These companies had built their businesses around navigating North Korean bureaucracy and unpredictability, but the Onsong Kulma shutdown exceeded even their expectations for sudden policy reversals. Russian tourists who had already paid the premium $1,800 package fees faced immediate financial consequences from the unexpected closure. These visitors had committed substantial portions of their discretionary income to what they believed would be a unique vacation experience in one of the world's most isolated countries. Many had also invested in international flights, visa fees, and travel insurance specifically for their North Korean adventures. The closure left them without clear recourse for recovering these expenses, as North Korean tourism agencies operated outside standard international consumer protection frameworks that might have provided remedies in other destinations. The financial implications extended beyond individual tourist losses to affect the broader network of businesses that had developed around North Korean tourism services. Russian travel agencies that had promoted Onsong Kulma packages faced potential liability for services they could no longer deliver. Hotels in neighboring countries that served as staging points for North Korean tour saw bookings cancelled as entire itineraries became impossible to complete. Airlines that had added capacity for Russian tourists traveling to North Korea through Chinese or Russian airports suddenly faced reduced demand that would affect their route planning and revenue projections. Speculation about the closure's underlying causes began immediately among analysts who specialized in North Korean affairs and tourism industry observers. Operational issues represented one possible explanation, suggesting that the resort systems and services had proven inadequate for international visitor standards, despite the impressive physical facilities. This theory gained support from reports of service problems and staffing inconsistencies that had emerged during the brief operational period. Technical difficulties with basic hospitality functions like food service, housekeeping, and guest services could have created embarrassing situations that North Korean authorities preferred to address privately rather than allow to continue under international scrutiny. Visitors reported highly controlled, guided interactions that aligned strictly with approved tourism itineraries, following patterns documented by organizations like Young Pioneer Tour in their operational guidelines. Tour guides and local participants were likely mobilized specifically for propaganda photo opportunities, consistent with established North Korean tourism practices analyzed by 38 North Research. These controlled interactions created an artificial atmosphere that experienced travelers could easily identify as staged rather than authentic cultural exchange. The closure followed a depressingly familiar pattern that had characterized North Korean economic projects for decades. Major initiatives would receive enormous publicity during launch phases, complete with ceremonial events and grandiose promises about their significance for national development. These projects would operate briefly or remain in development for extended periods before being quietly abandoned without explanation or accountability measures. The Ryugyong Hotel remained the most visible example of this pattern, but similar cycles had affected ski resorts, amusement parks, industrial facilities, and various tourism initiatives that had promised to transform North Korea's international image and economic prospects. The embarrassment factor associated with the Onsong Kulma closure created particularly acute problems for a regime that had invested enormous resources in promoting the resort as proof of North Korean achievements and capabilities. The June opening ceremony had been broadcast extensively across North Korean media networks, with Kim Jong-un's personal involvement lending maximum prestige to the project's success. International coverage had also been substantial, with news outlets around the world reporting on North Korea's ambitious tourism gamble and its potential implications for the country's economic development. The sudden closure undermined all of this positive messaging, creating a narrative of failure that directly contradicted the regime's carefully constructed propaganda about socialist achievements and international competitiveness. State media outlets that had previously celebrated Onsong Kulma's opening found themselves in the awkward position of avoiding any mention of the resort's closure or current status. North Korean broadcasting networks that had featured extensive coverage of the opening ceremonies made no reference to the suspension of tourist operations or the implications for future tourism development. This silence created additional intrigue among international observers who noted the stark contrast between the initial promotional enthusiasm and the subsequent information blackout surrounding the resort's operational problems. Resort's closure demonstrated North Korea's fundamental willingness to sacrifice immediate economic gains in order to protect the regime's carefully constructed international image from potential damage. Rather than risk continued observations or coverage from international visitors and media outlets, North Korean authorities chose to shut down operations entirely and return to the isolation that provided complete control over public narratives about the country's achievements and capabilities. This decision revealed the regime's assessment that maintaining propaganda narratives outweighed the financial benefits that successful tourism operations might have provided, suggesting that something more specific than general operational difficulties had triggered this dramatic response. The image control obsession. Understanding the specific trigger requires examining North Korea's pathological sensitivity to any suggestion that its tourism offerings might be artificially constructed or inauthentic. According to reports from the brief operational period, a Russian journalist covering the resort made observations about the staged nature of local participation in tourist activities. The journalist noted that many of the enthusiastic locals encountered during organized excursions appeared to be temporary participants mobilized by authorities rather than genuine residents going about their normal daily routines. These observations, though not particularly critical or hostile in tone, apparently crossed a red line for North Korean authorities, who viewed any suggestion of artificial staging as an unacceptable threat to the resort's credibility. The government has spent decades building elaborate facade systems designed to present carefully curated versions of North Korean society to foreign visitors. Every element of the tourist experience, from the orchestrated performances of local residents used in propaganda displays to the spotless agricultural cooperatives that visitors tour, represents deliberate staging intended to reinforce specific propaganda narratives about socialist success and popular satisfaction with the current government. Research by 38 North has documented these controlled interactions as standard practice across North Korean tourism operations, where authentic spontaneous encounters are systematically replaced with choreographed demonstrations. The regime's extreme sensitivity stems from its understanding that tourism credibility depends fundamentally on perceptions of authenticity, even when that authenticity is completely manufactured. International visitors expect to encounter genuine local culture and spontaneous interactions with ordinary citizens, creating inherent tensions with North Korea's need to control every aspect of foreign visitor experiences. The Russian journalist's observations threatened to expose this fundamental contradiction, suggesting that tourist encounters with locals were orchestrated performances rather than authentic cultural exchanges. This incident demonstrates the regime's consistent preference for complete isolation over accepting any risk to its carefully constructed international image. North Korean authorities would rather forfeit tourism revenue entirely than allow continued operations that might generate additional critical observations about the artificial nature of visitor experiences. The decision calculus reflects a fundamental belief that maintaining propaganda narratives takes precedence over economic considerations, regardless of the financial costs associated with shutting down revenue-generating activities. Even friendly Russian media coverage posed unacceptable risks to North Korean propaganda frameworks because any independent journalism threatens the regime's absolute control over information narratives. Russian journalists, despite their country's alliance with North Korea, operate according to professional standards that include observing and reporting on actual conditions rather than simply repeating approved talking points. The journalists' relatively neutral observations about staged local participation represented exactly the kind of uncontrolled narrative that North Korean authorities cannot tolerate, regardless of the observers' political sympathies or national allegiances. The fundamental incompatibility between tourism and totalitarian control became undeniably apparent through this incident. Successful tourism requires allowing visitors sufficient freedom to form authentic impressions and experiences, while totalitarian systems demand complete control over all information and interactions. These competing requirements cannot be reconciled through compromise or careful management because they represent diametrically opposed approaches to human interaction and information sharing. Tourism necessarily involves some degree of openness and authenticity that totalitarian governments view as existential threats to their control mechanisms. Kim Jong-un's government consistently prioritizes ideological purity over economic necessity, viewing any compromise of control systems as potentially catastrophic for regime stability. The leadership operates according to beliefs that economic hardship represents a manageable challenge, while loss of narrative control could trigger regime collapse. This perspective explains why North Korean authorities regularly choose isolation and economic deprivation over integration opportunities that might generate revenue, but require accepting reduced control over information flows and social interactions. North Korea's information control obsession intensified dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic, when border closures provided perfect cover for eliminating virtually all foreign contact that might challenge official narratives. The regime's pandemic response revealed the extent of its control mechanisms, with CSIS research documenting that 62% of respondents admitted to bribing quarantine officers during COVID, indicating the pervasive nature of the state's monitoring systems. This period of complete isolation allowed authorities to tighten information controls to unprecedented levels, making any return to international tourism operations particularly threatening to established security protocols. The pattern of overreaction to minor, perceived slights or criticisms has characterized North Korean behavior for decades across multiple international relationships and diplomatic contexts. The regime consistently responds to even constructive criticism or neutral observations with disproportionate defensive measures that often damage North Korea's own interests. Previous examples include cutting off profitable economic relationships with South Korea over relatively minor diplomatic disputes, suspending international aid programs because of bureaucratic disagreements, and canceling cultural exchanges due to perceived protocol violations that other countries would consider insignificant. These overreactions reflect the mindset that views any uncontrolled narrative as an existential threat, requiring immediate and decisive response. North Korean authorities operate according to zero-sum thinking about information control, believing that any independent observation or criticism, regardless of its accuracy or intent, undermines the entire foundation of their legitimacy. This perspective makes it impossible for the regime to engage in normal international relationships that require accepting some level of independent scrutiny and criticism as natural elements of diplomatic and economic cooperation. The regime's information control obsession extends beyond simple propaganda concerns to encompass fundamental fears about social stability and political legitimacy. North Korean leaders understand that their government's survival depends on maintaining popular beliefs about the outside world, North Korean achievements, and the necessity of current political arrangements. Any independent source of information that contradicts official narratives poses potential risks to these essential belief systems, making information control a matter of regime survival rather than simple preference for positive publicity. The Onsong Kulma closure ultimately demonstrated that no amount of desperately needed tourism revenue could override North Korea's obsession with controlling its international image and information narratives. The regime proved willing to sacrifice immediate economic benefits and long-term development opportunities rather than accept the minimal risks associated with allowing independent observers to document actual conditions at their flagship tourism facility. This decision revealed the true priorities governing North Korean policy-making, but it also raised questions about whether the regime could actually afford such expensive displays of ideological purity. Economic calculations. The closure of Onsong Kulma becomes far more comprehensible when examined through the lens of North Korea's dramatically improved financial position resulting from its military partnership with Russia. The regime's willingness to abandon tourism revenue that it had desperately needed just years earlier reflects a fundamental shift in economic calculations driven by new revenue streams that dwarf anything tourism could have provided. The military cooperation arrangement with Moscow has generated income levels that make the risks associated with international tourism seem unnecessary and potentially counterproductive for a government obsessed with maintaining complete control over its international image. North Korea's arms sales to Russia have produced a financial windfall that eclipses the country's previous tourism earnings by enormous margins. Intelligence estimates suggest that weapons transfers to support Russia's Ukraine war effort have generated approximately $5.5 billion in revenue for North Korea since 2023. This figure represents more than 30 times the annual tourism revenue that the country earned during its peak year of 2019, when 350,000 Chinese visitors contributed $175 million to the economy. The scale difference between these revenue streams fundamentally altered North Korea's economic priorities and reduced the urgency of developing sustainable tourism operations. The deployment of North Korean troops to fight alongside Russian forces in Ukraine's Kursk region has created an additional revenue stream projected to generate up to $572 million annually. This military personnel arrangement provides North Korea with steady income that operates completely outside international tourism markets and their associated volatility. The troop deployment revenue alone exceeds 3 times the total annual income that North Korea earned from international tourism during its most successful period, making military cooperation a far more lucrative economic activity than hospitality services. Military cooperation offers North Korea several crucial advantages over tourism as a revenue generation strategy. Arms sales and troop deployments provide predictable income streams based on contractual arrangements with the Russian government, eliminating the uncertainty associated with seasonal tourism patterns and changing consumer preferences. Military partnerships also operate independently of international travel restrictions, health concerns, and diplomatic tensions that can shut down tourism operations without warning. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how quickly external factors could eliminate tourism revenue entirely, while military cooperation continues regardless of global health situations or border closure policies. The sanctions resistance of military cooperation revenue represents another critical advantage over tourism income for North Korea's economic planning. Traditional sanctions enforcement mechanisms struggle to monitor and prevent military cooperation activities that occur in active conflict zones, while tourism transactions typically involve traceable financial systems subject to international oversight. Russian payments for North Korean military support can utilize alternative financial channels, including cryptocurrency, commodity exchanges, and direct barter arrangements that avoid traditional banking systems monitored by sanctions enforcement agencies. The premium pricing available through military cooperation far exceeds anything North Korea could charge international tourists for hospitality services. Russian payments for North Korean military support reflect the strategic value of these services in active combat situations where alternative suppliers may not be available or willing to provide similar assistance. Tourism pricing remains constrained by international market competition and consumer price sensitivity, limiting North Korea's ability to charge premium rates for vacation experiences that compete with established destinations, offering better amenities and fewer restrictions. Geographic and logistical considerations also favor military cooperation over tourism development for North Korean economic purposes. Military cooperation utilizes existing North Korean production capabilities, including weapons manufacturing, military training systems, and personnel deployment infrastructure that required minimal additional investment. Tourism development required massive construction projects, hospitality training programs, and service infrastructure development that consumed enormous resources before generating any revenue. The Onsong Kulma project represented years of construction investment that might never recover its development costs, while military cooperation generates immediate returns on existing capabilities. The durability of military cooperation relationships provides North Korea with economic security that tourism partnerships cannot match. Military alliances typically survive diplomatic disputes and political changes that might disrupt tourism relationships, creating more stable long-term revenue prospects. Tourist-source countries can implement travel restrictions or impose diplomatic pressure that eliminates visitor flows overnight, while military partnerships continue operating despite broader international tensions. Russia's strategic need for North Korean military support transcends normal diplomatic considerations, providing relationship stability that tourism partnerships lack. International isolation actually enhances the value of North Korea's military cooperation services rather than limiting them, creating a competitive advantage that tourism development cannot replicate. North Korea's willingness to provide military support without regard for international legal constraints makes its services particularly valuable to partners facing international sanctions and diplomatic pressure. Tourism development requires international integration and positive relationships with multiple countries, while military cooperation benefits from North Korea's isolation and disregard for international norms that other countries respect. The scalability of military cooperation revenue offers additional advantages over tourism income potential. North Korea can expand arms production and increase troop deployments based on Russian demand without facing the infrastructure constraints that limit tourism growth. Onsong Kulma's maximum capacity of 20,000 visitors represented a physical ceiling that could not be exceeded without additional construction investment. Military cooperation can expand through increased production schedules and larger personnel deployments that utilize North Korea's substantial population and industrial capacity more efficiently than tourism operations. The combination of higher revenue potential, greater reliability, sanctions resistance, and reduced control risks makes military cooperation economically superior to tourism for North Korea's current strategic situation. The Russian military partnership provided sufficient financial security to make tourism's modest revenue potential irrelevant compared to its substantial risks to regime image and information control. This economic calculation explains why North Korean authorities chose to close Onsong Kulma rather than risk continued operations that might generate negative publicity or critical observations from international visitors. The resort's closure marked not just the end of one ambitious project, but the abandonment of an entire economic sector that had once seemed essential for the country's financial survival. The broader tourism industry collapse. The collapse extends far beyond Onsong Kulma to encompass the complete disintegration of North Korea's entire tourism sector. What was once a carefully cultivated revenue stream generating $175 million annually has been reduced to empty facilities and abandoned development plans scattered across the country. The industry that attracted 350,000 Chinese visitors in 2019 now exists only as a collection of unused infrastructure and cancelled tour programs that serve as monuments to a dead economic sector. Chinese tourists, who historically represented over 95% of North Korea's international visitors, remain completely absent despite periodic speculation about potential reopening initiatives. This absence reflects fundamental changes in diplomatic relationships that have eliminated the foundation upon which North Korean tourism was built. The tour buses that once crossed the Dandong border carrying thousands of Chinese visitors each month, have been replaced by empty checkpoint facilities and unused transportation networks. The diplomatic breakdown with Beijing has created an economic catastrophe that extends far beyond simple visitor statistics, eliminating business relationships and infrastructure connections that took decades to develop. Chinese tour operators who had built their businesses around North Korean packages have redirected their efforts towards Southeast Asian destinations that offer more reliable access and fewer political complications. The network of travel agencies, transportation companies, and hospitality providers that facilitated North Korean tourism has moved on to other markets, leaving behind relationships that cannot be easily rebuilt even if diplomatic conditions improve. These business connections represented crucial infrastructure for international tourism that has been permanently lost through North Korea's strategic realignments. North Korea's attempts to replace Chinese visitors with tourists from other countries have failed comprehensively, demonstrating the impossibility of replacing such a massive visitor base through diversification strategies. Russian tourists, despite their government's alliance with North Korea, represent a tiny fraction of the numbers that Chinese visitors once provided. The 880 Russian visitors documented in 2024 constitute less than 0.25% of the Chinese tourist numbers from 2019. Even dramatic expansion of Russian tourism could never approach the scale necessary to restore tourism as a significant economic sector. Western tourism efforts have produced even more disappointing results, with attempted reopening initiatives lasting only weeks before being abandoned entirely. The brief reopening of the Rason Special Economic Zone to limited Western visitor access in February 2025 generated minimal interest and was quickly discontinued without explanation. The U.S. travel ban extension through August 31, 2026, continues to eliminate American tourists who had previously represented a small but symbolically important visitor category. European and other Western tourists remain effectively blocked by a combination of sanctions concerns, safety warnings, and North Korean restrictions that make travel arrangements nearly impossible. The structural problems preventing tourism recovery extend beyond diplomatic tensions to encompass fundamental changes in international travel patterns and risk assessments. Insurance companies now classify North Korea as too dangerous for standard travel coverage, forcing potential visitors to seek specialized policies that cost more than most tour packages. Airlines have eliminated direct flight connections that previously facilitated tourist access, requiring complex routing through third countries that adds substantial time and expense to any North Korean vacation. These practical barriers create obstacles that persist regardless of political relationships or tourism policy changes. International sanctions enforcement has created additional complications that make North Korean tourism financially and legally problematic for visitors from most countries. Payment processing for tourism services involves complex compliance requirements that discourage casual travel planning and create liability concerns for travel agencies. Financial institutions that facilitate international tourism transactions have largely withdrawn from North Korean-related activities, leaving tourists with limited options for booking and paying for travel services. These financial barriers operate independently of political considerations and continue regardless of diplomatic developments. The economic costs of Kim Jong-un's diplomatic realignments become particularly apparent when measured against the tourism industry's previous contributions to foreign currency earnings. The $175 million in annual tourism revenue represented clean foreign currency income that required minimal infrastructure investment compared to other economic activities. Tourism revenue flowed directly into sectors that employed thousands of North Koreans and supported related industries, including transportation, food service, and retail operations. The loss of this income stream created unemployment and reduced economic activity that extended throughout the North Korean economy. Tourism infrastructure investments made during the industry's peak years now represent massive sunk costs that generate no economic returns. Hotels built specifically for international visitors sit empty while their maintenance costs continue accumulating. Transportation systems designed to move tourist groups operate far below capacity, creating operational inefficiencies that drain resources from other economic activities. The Onsong Kulma Resort itself represents hundreds of millions of dollars in construction investment that will likely never generate sufficient revenue to justify its development costs. The strategic pivot toward military partnerships has made tourism revival unnecessary from North Korean economic planning perspectives, eliminating the urgency that might have driven efforts to solve the industry's fundamental problems. Military cooperation with Russia generates far more reliable revenue than tourism ever provided. Arms sales have generated an estimated $5.5 billion since 2023, according to NK News, while troop deployments yield approximately $264 million annually based on roughly $2,000 per soldier monthly payments for an estimated 11,000 troops. These military revenues dwarf tourism's previous contributions while requiring none of the compromises in control and information management that tourism demands. Alternative payment channels circumvent sanctions enforcement, according to expert commentary, making military cooperation financially superior to tourism operations. The failure to attract sustainable tourism from any source country demonstrates that North Korea's tourism problems extend beyond diplomatic relationships to encompass fundamental incompatibilities between international travel expectations and North Korean control systems. Modern international tourists expect levels of freedom, authenticity, and service quality that North Korean authorities cannot provide while maintaining the control mechanisms they consider essential for regime security. This incompatibility makes tourism development a structurally impossible challenge regardless of which countries serve as visitor sources. Onsong Kulma's closure marked the definitive end of North Korea's tourism industry as a viable economic sector, confirming that the country has chosen complete economic isolation over the compromises necessary for international integration. This decision reveals something profound about the regime's fundamental priorities and the calculations driving its most important strategic choices. What this reveals about Kim Jong-un's strategy. The Onsong Kulma saga provides an extraordinary window into Kim Jong-un's fundamental approach to leadership and governance, revealing a decision-making process that consistently prioritizes regime control over economic rationality. The resort's dramatic rise and fall demonstrates how personal obsessions and ideological considerations drive major policy decisions that affect millions of North Korean citizens and the country's international relationships. Kim Jong-un's willingness to invest enormous resources in a tourism project only to abandon it weeks after opening shows a leadership style that treats the national economy as a tool for personal validation rather than a means of improving living conditions or achieving sustainable development. The economic sacrifices associated with the Onsong Kulma closure illuminate the regime's fundamental calculation that maintaining absolute control outweighs any potential financial benefits from international engagement. Kim Jong-un demonstrated his willingness to forfeit the $175 million in annual tourism revenue that North Korea had previously generated, according to NK News and Reuters data, rather than accept even minimal risks to the regime's carefully constructed propaganda narratives. This decision reveals a governing philosophy that views economic hardship as a manageable challenge, while considering any loss of information control as an existential threat to regime survival. The closure cost North Korea immediate tourism revenue and long-term credibility with potential international partners, but these losses were deemed acceptable compared to the risks of allowing uncontrolled foreign observations. The episode demonstrates the fundamental incompatibility between the openness required for successful international tourism and the authoritarian control mechanisms that Kim Jong-un considers essential for regime security. Modern tourism inherently involves allowing foreigners to observe local conditions and form independent judgments about what they experience, creating information control challenges that totalitarian governments cannot resolve through careful management or staging. The regime's inability to tolerate even neutral observations from friendly Russian journalists about staged local participation shows that no level of diplomatic alliance can override the basic tensions between tourism and authoritarianism. Kim Jong-un's approach to the Onsong Kulma project reflects a broader shift from the economic pragmatism that characterized earlier periods of North Korean development toward a military-first foreign policy that prioritizes security partnerships over commercial relationships. This transformation became apparent through the timing correlation between the resort's revival and North Korea's deepening military cooperation with Russia. The leader's decision to pursue arms sales and troop deployments rather than sustainable tourism development shows a strategic calculation that military partnerships offer more reliable revenue streams while avoiding the control compromises that international tourism requires. Personal obsessions and image concerns clearly drove major aspects of the Onsong Kulma project in ways that compromised its economic viability and operational success. Kim Jong-un's childhood connections to the Onson region influenced his determination to transform the coastal area into a world-class destination, regardless of practical considerations about market demand or operational feasibility. The location's historical significance as the site where Kim Il-sung landed with Soviet troops in 1945 added ideological weight that made the project about regime legitimacy rather than simple economic development. These personal and political factors created unrealistic expectations that doomed the resort to failure when reality failed to match the leader's grandiose vision. The pattern of grandiose announcements, followed by quiet abandonment when practical realities intrude, has become a defining characteristic of Kim Jong-un's governance approach across multiple sectors and policy areas. The Onsong Kulma timeline followed this familiar cycle precisely, beginning with elaborate opening ceremonies and state media celebrations, only to end with unexplained closure and official silence about the project's problems. This pattern mirrors previous failed mega-projects, including the notorious Ryugyong Hotel, ski resorts, amusement parks, and various industrial facilities that received enormous publicity during launch phases before being quietly abandoned when operational challenges emerged. The resort's closure reflects broader themes in North Korean governance that consistently prioritize propaganda value over practical effectiveness in policy implementation. Kim Jong-un's government operates according to beliefs that successful international messaging about regime achievements outweighs the actual success or failure of underlying projects and programs. The June opening ceremony was designed primarily as a propaganda spectacle for international consumption rather than a genuine tourism launch, with the Russian ambassador's participation serving diplomatic messaging purposes that were more important than operational readiness or service quality considerations. The regime's calculation that isolation represents a preferable alternative to accepting any loss of absolute control became unmistakably clear through the Onsong Kulma decision-making process. Rather than attempting to address the operational problems that led to critical observations from international visitors, Kim Jong-un chose to eliminate foreign access entirely and return to the complete isolation that provides maximum control over information narratives. This choice reveals the leadership's fundamental assessment that economic integration with the international community requires unacceptable compromises in regime control mechanisms that could potentially threaten government stability. The contrast between Kim Jong-un's ambitious rhetoric about competing internationally and his unwillingness to accept the practical requirements of international competition reveals fundamental contradictions in the regime's approach to economic development. The leader promotes grandiose projects designed to demonstrate North Korean capabilities while refusing to implement the operational changes necessary for actual success in international markets. This contradiction creates a cycle of failed initiatives that consume enormous resources without generating sustainable economic benefits or improvements in international relationships. The Onsong Kulma experience also illuminates how Kim Jong-un's personal involvement in major projects creates additional pressures that compromise rational decision-making and resource allocation. The leader's ceremonial tour and personal endorsement of the resort made its success a matter of regime prestige that influenced subsequent decisions about its operation and closure. When operational problems emerged that threatened to embarrass the regime, the personal stakes involved made abandoning the entire project preferable to acknowledging failures or implementing necessary improvements that might require accepting reduced control over visitor experiences. The closure underscores the fundamental clash between tourism openness and North Korea's need for absolute information control, as documented in CSIS reports analyzing the regime's governance patterns. This episode demonstrates that Kim Jong-un's government remains incapable of balancing the openness required for international economic integration with the control mechanisms that the regime considers essential for survival. The Onsong Kulma debacle perfectly encapsulates the contradictions and limitations of Kim Jong-un's rule, showing a leadership approach that consistently prioritizes short-term control over long-term development while pursuing grandiose projects that serve propaganda purposes rather than addressing genuine economic needs. The mathematics behind this strategic choice reveal the true scale of Kim Jong-un's transformation of North Korea's economic priorities. The regime abandoned $175 million in annual tourism revenue, according to NK News data, in favor of military partnerships that have generated an estimated $5.5 billion in arms sales since 2023, plus additional troop deployment payments documented by CSIS sources. This represents a 30-fold increase in revenue generation that operates completely outside international tourism markets and their associated control compromises. The Onsong Kulma failure shows North Korea choosing isolation over integration, cementing tourism's end under Kim Jong-un.